And okay, and I have to put got it. Okay, there we go. All right, so the 8th chapter in our book was, there you go, was behavior. And I thought this was a really interesting chapter myself, because as I thought about it a lot, I'm thinking, I have some work to do there. It makes me think in a different way. And one of the things I also noticed was I don't have very many people of color, not of European descent, in my life. Like there's nobody, no Black people live in my neighborhood, none go to my church. Although I've at various times I've had that, but I thought, I wonder what I've been taught. This behavior one made me think a lot about what I've been taught, and makes me rethink some of that. So on behavior, it says to be anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. Whenever an anti-racist sees individuals behaving positively or negatively, the anti-racist sees exactly that, individuals behaving, not representatives of whole races. To be anti-racist is to deracialize behavior, to remove the tattooed stereotype from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races do. And one of the things I was also thinking about is my son-in-law is from Russia, and we spent one New Year's Eve with them, and they had another couple from Russia over, my daughter and son-in-law, and my mother and his mother also was there. And wow, could they drink? I mean, they drank so much. I've never seen so many people drink all those shots that they were drinking. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, look how much Russians drink. And that is exactly an example of behavior, racialist behavior. Because I'm thinking like, well, they do, and a couple of them do, not the whole group. So I thought it gave me, that's just started one place to think about. But let us begin with a prayer. There is no me without you. We shape one another. The sacred that birthed us weaves our life together so that we can only find ourselves through the shared becoming. For my journey and all its winding ways for yours, for all the saints who labored for what is, all the kin whose lives made ours possible, for all those yet to come, for whom living our truths today will mean breaking possibilities open for them tomorrow. We pause, we acknowledge, we give thanks. Amen. And our scripture that it had to go with this today is from Luke, and it was Luke 18:9-14. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying, "Thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves and rogues and adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. And What does distinctions does Kendai make between culture and behavior in this chapter? And they have especially on 95. What is that distinction important, and how does it help you understand behavioral racism? What did what struck you mostly here about behavioral racism
I think
in this chapter?
what came out to me, maybe this is a simplification, but the idea of stereotyping, that because you see certain behavior and you see a person of a particular ethnic group doing that, you can't stereotype and say that's a behavior of, just as you were saying about the Russians, that we can't do that for any group, that it's individuals who behave in a certain way, and we can't really stereotype that a whole group of people do that just because we observe a behavior of one person.
I was watching a history on the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington the other day, and one of the commentators reminded us that when that happened, a lot of white families who lived in the area of Washington, D.C., they told their wives not to go to work that day because they might be raped by all those black men. That's a good example of it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What struck me about this chapter is that it almost takes on the cliche that we have about how sometimes stereotypes exist because they're true. And like I think about, we went on a trip this summer up to Niagara Falls with the family and stuff like that, and we did the Maid of the Mist. And while we were waiting to get on the Maid of the Mist, the group that was exiting ahead of us were all filing off the Maid of the Mist, filing off the Maid of the Mist. And we took notice that one of the last groups of folks who were straggling to get off were still taking photos and stuff, posing for last photos and taking more photos, and like not in any hurry to get off. And they were an Asian, like it was a group of Asian folks, which is totally fits that sort of stereotype that we have of Asian tourists. And it's one of those things, like sometimes those stereotypes of what these behaviors are, when they're proven, when we see evidence of their truth, we go, well, right. But I think what this chapter did, especially with the cultural piece of it, like behaviors are learned. And I think realizing that even if these behaviors seem to be true for along a racial line, there's a cultural learned aspect to that, not necessarily a racially learned aspect to that.
Right.
And I think that's part of, like, it's just, I mean, honestly, it's the same thing, like, the behavior of white women, like Karens, right? You only hear about Karens being angry white women. And it's like, okay, that's a behavior that we assume is specific to that particular racial, but it's also, but that's a learned privilege kind of a thing, not necessarily a racial thing. And so I think his distinction between sort of the cultural learned behavior versus a racial behavior was helpful. Especially given when we see that there is some truth to what we typically think of as the racial behaviors. It helps separate that from race and still explain why we see some of these behaviors repeated among certain groups, where it's not necessarily a racial thing, it's a cultural learned thing.
Right, but it also points out that it's a cultural thing, and that us as white people viewing that behavior and saying that that's typical of that particular group, that's from a white biased perspective.
Mm.
If if we looked at that person and said, oh, they're being very Asian, because that's what Asians' cultural norms are, and that's okay because that's how they're groomed, and those are the important things in their culture and their life. Their emphasis is maybe on something different than ours. I think that's really evident when you start to look at different countries, because we look at it from an American white perspective, and other countries look at us as though we're the odd ones out because we work too much. We put too much emphasis on things and not people and things like that. So I think we all come from that kind of point of view. It's a problem, though, when we start to see it as a negative, those characteristics as not cultural, but racist.
Like who's setting the bar for the culture? Like we're setting it according to our expectations. And that's biased, is what I hear you saying, or I think about when you say that.
Right, and that's what assimilationists
Yeah.
ism is all about. And it's really hard for me to unwrap my brain of assimilation because we were always groomed on that everyone
Right.
who comes into the country tries to be like everyone else as an American, homogenous society. And that it only has been in the last couple of years that I realized that's a modernist perspective. That's a modern construct that was created back in the turn of the 20th century. That's what the homogeneous society was all about. That was what modern art was all about, universality of art and architecture and everything. So we have that cultural construct that has kind of shaped our perspective, thinking that everyone has to assimilate into our culture, however we define it. And it's not what it used to be.
No. And one of the things I think about is when I think about behavior is, do we have any line of where behavior goes then? I don't know. A while ago, Alan had said something about, well, I see bad behavior or, something. Well, it makes you think, that's all. What is it all cultural? Is it all behavior? Is it all, are we in a place where we're changing expectations between what is cultural and what is behavior and all that I hear? So
yeah.
I think that's what I struggle with this book because I see he struggles with this too.
Yeah. Reading this book and some of the other recent, it really has given me a broader understanding of what persons of color feel like and have felt like for a long time, but haven't been able to say. And like you said, sometimes I struggle, and sometimes I see they're struggling to express it too. But thank goodness, at least now the stories are being told. What we do with them and how they impact us remains to be seen, but at least they're being told.
And that's what I thought after we saw his at the General Synod, the video of that, because that made me really think, well, who's he to be saying all this? I was struggling with that some, but I think now that I've revisited the book some, with some of this stuff on getting ready for this for sure. I think it's helping me understanding, it's gelling better, because some of the statements that he made, where to, we weren't there to ask him or talk to him about it. So, what I need, a lot is a conversation. I wish we could have some conversations with people of color to hear what they're thinking with the same book or behavior or something. Because I thought one of the chapters we'll get to later is about black and whites, and they have racist thoughts too.
Oh yeah, you should have heard some of my husband's Indian friends talking about that, about the racism, their racism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that they're racist as well as being discriminated against as well. Yeah, I was thinking too that I was watching before I came into the group, watching the news, and they were talking about this young black man who's in jail because waiting for a trial on RICO charges, the same charges that the Trump people are, RICO charges. And only this guy has to stay in prison, and all the Trumpsters get to go home before their trial. And I was thinking that I'm sure you've heard the stories about our corporate prisons and how these companies that own the prisons will often pay off the judges to get guilty charges for prisoners so that they can fill their prisons and get more money. But I'm thinking that too, that most of those people that end up there are black, and that's taking advantage of our racism in this country. That's that behavior and that assumption that that's the best that they can do, that we can't trust them to be home or whatever. Yeah.
And one of the things that I noticed about the behavior is it's not all like a lot of the behavior is because of economic differences. I mean, a whole lot to me is economic difference. And he brought out on 100 and 101 when he talks about the standardized testing. I was one of the things is, the school districts, the Philadelphia school districts get about $5,000 or $6,000 per student, something like that. I forget. I haven't looked it up in a while. But then what neighboring school districts get $20,000 per student. Well, who's, not that we can throw money and fix everything, but that accounts for some of the behavior. Economic differences, it just seemed to be so much for me. And he talked about standardized testing, that who's setting the standard for the testing? Are we testing people's, he talked about that, about the GREs, that he had to go away. There was a GRE prep course, cost $1,000. But it wasn't at his university. He had to go somewhere else to take that because it wasn't offered there. Well, and who doesn't have $1,000, all these things. And it wasn't teaching them, it was teaching them how to take a test and get a better score. So that's the economic disparity is one of the things that I have to, think about this some too, is because isn't that, maybe the economic disparity leads to more drug behavior and they have to live in really lousy housing. So is that the disparity that, that causes, if you have to live that close to your neighbor, that you fight with your neighbor when you have to live with them, or so close, things like that. So I thought that had a lot to do with behavior, I think it's not brought into the book as much.
I think one of his main themes is that racism is institutional. It's a policy and procedure. It's not individuals. It's policies and procedures that create the economic inequalities, that
Yes.
lead to the different behaviors, that lead to the situations that we have. And addressing the policies and procedures, changing the system, I think is really his goal. And
Right.
that's the challenge. In some ways, our United Church of Christ at least talks that talk, that we're for social justice, meaning change the system, not just be kind to your neighbor. But doing that is, for me, a real challenge to know where to get involved and how do you engage the system, create systemic policy change.
And one of the things I wished in the book, he pointed out, he talks about policy a whole lot. And I need somebody to point me and say, this policy, I need to understand more about how they're racist, the policies. I mean, I'm not disagreeing that they're there, but some of them I didn't, I couldn't, I wished he would have said everyday policies that, that,
Well, I imagine if you talk to Greg Edwards, he could point you in the right direction as to where to get engaged in creating systemic change, because it seems to me that he is pretty oriented in that direction, changing policy procedure, particularly with Allentown School District and some of the inequities and inequalities in Allentown.
right. And that's sad. I mean, all that. On 95 to 98, he talks of dig deeper into the nuances and the what he calls oppression inferiority. In what ways have you participated in the kind of behavioral racism he describes here, specifically attributing behavior characteristics to entire racial group? And how has that impacted your affirmation of individual human dignity? And that's one of the things I was saying is that, we have been taught these things, as Matt had said, a lot of times our culture has taught us certain things about certain groups and people and not individuals with that. And and then he does talk about the oppression. He was talking about he was oppressed. He learned those things about himself, Black people, that.
I was just thinking in my lily white neighborhood where I was growing up, the issue wasn't racism, it was religious. The Catholics were bad people. And yes, and so that's, I think, like when Kennedy was elected and then assassinated, that was a definite, I could feel a definite reaction in my community because of that. The people talking about Catholics and not trusting them. Yeah. But that's because of there was no opportunity to talk about racism there. We had 2 Black families in my high school. That was it. 2 people.
Right.
Yeah.
And we were meeting with some friends recently, and then our friend told us, yeah, I grew up with all Jewish neighbors. He said, because and he's outside of Philadelphia, he says, because some Jewish person bought all the land and only would sell houses to Jewish people. He was a builder and he would only build houses for Jewish people. So they moved in this neighborhood. And then he said, as they got more money, they moved out. So we stayed. And so all my friends were Jewish. And, so that's about the same. So
I was wondering what you folks, the concept post-traumatic slave syndrome. It's interesting. He talked about post-traumatic slave syndrome as a concept that was developed to explain some of the anger and rage that persons of color have. And I was wondering what you folks thought about that notion of post-traumatic slave syndrome that I don't know.
No, I remember reading it. Oh, there it is. Okay, it's on 97-ish on your book
Yeah,
anyway.
in
Okay.
my book, but I guess, I don't know. One of the stereotypes that I have had at times is it seems as though African American blacks who've lived in this country are more angry than some of the Caribbean and island folks that come here. And I began to develop this notion that, well, if my ancestors were slaves, I'd be pretty angry too. And so this notion of post-traumatic slave syndrome seemed to make sense to me, that explains some of the anger and rage that persons of color have. But I just wondered if any of you ever had any reflections on that notion.
I was
Yes,
one of
ma'am.
the ones that went out to the Native American school in Cumberland County a couple weeks ago with the Penn Northeast Conference. And all that we could see were the cemetery where they have the children buried that died there, the Native American children. And personally, I was just damn angry that, we live in a country that could do that kind of thing ever, and that is still doing that kind of thing. Maybe not as obvious, but so I think for maybe I have a different kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome, as being an ancestor of a slaveholder. Maybe I don't know if that I am, because my grandfather came from Italy when I was very young, but when he was very young. So I don't know. I mean, I think there really is such a thing.
Yeah, I think so too. When you read the scriptures all draw us back to the past, the history of Moses and the journey of the Israelites, and the sins committed, and the mercy and forgiveness of God to turn things around. So we have a history of always reflecting on the past. So why wouldn't we feel that guilt? And that's why I was struggling with why people are struggling with this issue of racism. And I believe that's why, because in the church we share the sins of our forefathers and in the Bible, and therefore in our history. We also are proud of our forefathers who did some good things for our country. So there's pride in there too. And there's also pride in the history of the Bible as well, or joy. Pride's probably not the right word. But I think it's hard. You can't separate the two. We all suffer some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder from our past, I would imagine. And I would think maybe the way he labels that made me aware that, yeah, that would make sense. That if your ancestors were slaves, you don't feel good about that yet because you haven't learned enough about where did they come from, what was going on before they got here and were dehumanized in that way. And then to celebrate what they were able to accomplish under those kinds of difficult circumstances, to celebrate that. I think we're all in the same process, that whole process. And until we go through all of that and celebrate that people pushed forward and moved on and that we're at a better place today, I don't think we're going to be able to get through this as a nation, or even as a world. The whole world's struggling with this, even Europe.
Right.
you know, because we all realize we
Well,
come,
go ahead. Well, I
I
was
was just
going to
going to say,
say, in the book here, it talks about that researchers found that among soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, PTSD ranged from 13 to 30%. He said, and Kendai says, but there's a thin line between an anti-racist saying individual Blacks have suffered trauma and a racist being saying that Blacks are traumatized people. There is similarly a thin line between an anti-racist saying slavery was debilitating and a racist saying Blacks are debilitated people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's similar to, I heard recently, or maybe you folks all know this, that instead of calling Black slaves, the term is people who were enslaved.
Yes.
That's claiming the person rather than to give them a title that they were slaves, which is very depersonalizing. I think that's similar to what he's saying there, is yes, people have been debilitated from it, but they're not debilitated people. They've been injured, but they're not flawed.
Right. And that varies between not everybody feels flawed that way, or, you know.
you know, and I was just thinking about what I had said, and I don't think that is, there's not everyone carries the guilt of our people of the past. There was I can't remember where I read it, but someone did some research on the Contras in like Nicaragua and different places in Central America back in, what was that, the 70s or
70s,
I can't-
80s, yeah.
yeah. And there were such horrific atrocities. What was his name? The priest Romero was
Romero.
killed, and all
Oscar Romero.
kinds of horrible things were taking place. And they interviewed those people involved with all those really horrific events, and many of them did not share any guilt whatsoever. They had no remorse for the actions that they did, and I was astounded. I couldn't believe it that would not damage you in some way for carrying out such horrific acts on other human beings. But they found that many of them did not carry that burden. So it is, this is difficult.
And on the other side, I had at Church of the Manger, there was a German woman from Germany, and she was constantly telling people, her friends, that she had been part of Hitler Youth. And it was guilt that she didn't do anything. She was just a kid, and she left after that. But just the tremendous guilt she felt for having had a positive feeling about Hitler at that point in her life. She could never get over it. She could never get over it. That's PTSD to me. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of our veterans suffer from that. I know my ex mother-in-law, I don't know if that's an appropriate term, but her husband was in World War II, and he suffered all the time. He could never get over the war. He ended up in Germany liberating, and he could not he wouldn't talk about it. He only started to open up later in his life. He started opening up to his son-in-laws, but it was, you could tell that damaged him deeply. And they weren't doing real horrific things. They were just doing what they were supposed to be doing, but still, it really made an impact. Uh, so I think even this book is only scratching the surface.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Well, one of the things that was thinking about when Dennis was saying, I don't know why we folks struggle to sort of accept this history, and I think about what I thought about was, is it Ezekiel, where Ezekiel talks about that contrast between, what we used to think was, the parents' sins are visited upon the next generation and children's teeth are set on edge, right? And sort of that idea. And in our current society, nobody wants to hear that. Everybody wants to go with sort of what Ezekiel says, which is no longer that. It's you are accountable for what you do. And everybody says, well, I didn't own slaves. So,
Right.
it's not on me. And we don't think about the generational dynamics of it. But maybe Ezekiel's wrong. Like, I think there is a sense in which there is as much a generational guilt as there is a generational hurt. And I think that's where that sort of post-traumatic slave, where he's coming from, is this sense of, like, if we can inherit, not inherit, if we can learn from one generation to the next the biases and prejudices and things that sort of are passed down to us, then why can't, on the other side of things, folks learn the hurt and trauma and things that have been passed down as well? I think there's something to that. And I think then there's something triggering to somebody being in a country that they were brought to forcefully, not willingly, and then being told that they're not welcome in this country. Like, okay, they didn't ask to be here in the first place. Like, yeah, that would be triggering. That makes sense to me. Even if they hadn't been slaves themselves, it makes sense that when there would be that legacy and sort of generational hurt, that would trigger something in them of this is an echo of a familiar hurt. I don't know. I think there's the generational piece to it makes sense to me.
And I just think, too, of all the movies that depict the slavery and not in a good light. I mean, that they try to show the injustices of slavery, and look at Roots. Are any of you old enough to remember Roots? Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, to watch that to watch those movies and Roots as a Black person, as an African American, that's a whole different experience than what I have of watching those films, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's why I think it's a whole learning. This is a whole learning for me. It's opening your eyes and looking and hearing what they say and letting it gel there a while. And then I think that's helpful for me to take all this in. It's not going to be solved in one book. But it's opening our eyes if we can open them and listen and think about how we've all been educated in different ways. So.
I wonder if, Linda, you made a point earlier about having an interracial discussion. Here we are, and I know we white folks have to do our work for ourselves, but I wonder if we had an intergenerational discussion, if some of this would be embarrassing to persons of color because they've had to use so much denial to live in the world that we live in. And the reason I say that, one of my greatest learning experiences after I retired, I was invited down to the University of Pennsylvania to supervise the unit of clinical training, and I had 6 African American women as my peer group. And me being the stupid white guy, I mean, we talked about that a lot, but I thought, well, this might be a good chance to explore womanist theology, Black women's theology, like bell hooks and stuff like that. So we read a few of his books. Those women did not like that. Maybe it's because I was a white guy inviting them to look at that. But, they did not want to be talking about how brutal white people have been to Black people. So I do think
With
that,
white people. They couldn't
right.
discuss it with white people. That's what.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I think there's a need for us to be talking to this with different groups. Anyhow.
Well, it's a good discussion to have within ourselves, and then, and then also with people of color, because I think that would be helpful.
I had an interesting experience, and I can't remember if it was on this book or I think it was on another racial diversity class or for the conference, and I was talking about that I worked in a corporation, and I worked next to and with back then we called people of color African Americans. We weren't calling them Black, because we used to call people of African ancestry. We used to call them Black, and then it was taboo to call them Black, but to call them African American. And then somewhere it changed again. So I don't know. I'm always
Right.
confused. I'm always off the page. But I worked with a lot of diversity because I worked for Prudential Insurance, which is national. It's huge. And in many layers. I mean, our vice president was African American and or from descendant from African American. And so I said my manager was a descendant of African descent. And I made the comment that I didn't see a difference between and I didn't feel I was racist because I worked with Black people and some were my managers and some were my VPs, and we worked on the same level. We worked on projects, and we attended different events. Attended parties at their house and beautiful homes in Bucks County and things like that. And the comment was, but they were not being themselves in the corporate world. When they go to corporate, they take on a different persona. Okay. And I thought, I never considered that, but then again, in a sense, we all do that.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah. I'm in my heart, I'm a 5-year-old from a farm community in Berks County, because that's where I was born and raised. And I tried to put on the adult face and the somewhat educated face in certain, when I'm out and about. So, but that threw me because I didn't realize there was a difference. The other thing I could relate to is growing up in a farm community and being raised in the Grange. That's a very close society. And there is kind of like a communication in that group that doesn't transcend to everybody else out in the community. and maybe that's what they were talking about, is that uh, one of the people on the panel from uh, African descent is the one who made that comment, that they are not showing how you live as a Black person in America when you're in the corporate environment. And
They've assimilated, because they've assimilated. And it is, I think he talks a little bit about that they, like he talked about Clarence Thomas before in his video we saw, too. Well, how about here's
Right.
something I'll leave us with, and then we can move on to the next chapter. It says, Kendai says, as long as the mind thinks there's something behaviorally wrong with a racial group, the mind can never be anti-racist. As long as the mind oppresses the oppressed by thinking their oppressive environment has retarded their behavior, the mind can never be anti-racist. As long as the mind is racist, the mind can never be free.
Mhm.
So I think those are good thoughts to think about as we sort of end the chapter here, because, we can, I don't think it's solved, at least for me. I have to look around now at people, Black people that I see, and remind myself of what this says. And I've been finding myself doing that a lot. It's like, oh, okay, well, let's think on these things, because again, my mind isn't going to be open to all one thing, in one instant. And that's why all these things take time to work on and think about, because we've learned a lot. So how about if we move on to chapter 9, and it talks about, that's color. So it's not all very far away from what we're talking about. And to be color, this is chapter 9. It says to be anti-racist is to focus on color lines as much as racial lines, knowing that color lines are especially harmful for dark people. Darkness, and God separated light from the dark, and in the dark the land rested, the people slept, and the plants breathed, the world retreated the first night, and God said that the darkness was good. That's something to think about, isn't it? And this brings in Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only, I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you were right in your verdict and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Yet you desired faithfulness even in the womb. You taught me wisdom in that secret place. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. Then I will teach transgressors your ways so that sins will turn back to you. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God, you who are God, my Savior, and my tongue will sing of your righteousness. Open my lips, Lord, and my mouth will declare your praise. You do not delight in sacrifices, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise. May it please you to prosper Zion, to build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in the sacrifices of the righteous, in burnt offerings offered whole. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. And they have words from John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. True light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. Those are the scriptures that go with our chapter. How has Christian practice of associating light or whiteness with goodness, purity, righteousness, and darkness or blackness with evil, defilement, sinfulness contributed to colorism as Kendai defines it?
It's not just in Christianity. When I was a student in India many, many years ago, I went to a village, a very remote village, and the women came up to me and were checking me out. They thought I was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen because my skin was so light.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's even today. My son's first wife was Thai, and she would wear sunscreen all the time because she said that if she's is exposed to the sun, she will get very dark, and that's frowned upon in the Thai culture as well.
And even I'm thinking of Gone with the Wind. Remember, they had to wear gloves and they had hats and everything, and because they wanted to keep their skin white. It was terrible to be tan.
And there's a lot of I think if you go to an African cosmetics place, you can find skin lighteners that a lot of women use.
Well, he talks about that a lot in this chapter.
That's right. That's right. That's where I saw it.
Yes, he says skin color influences perceptions of attractiveness most often for Black women. As skin tone lightens, levels of self-esteem among Black women rises, especially among low and middle income Black women. And he does talk a lot in this chapter about lighter skin, dark people get the better jobs. And, you know, and he points that out statistically.
Reading this listening to this discussion and thinking about this, do any of you remember the Black is Beautiful movement?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It was back in the way back in the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, I think so.
Probably the 70s.
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't remember that movement, Alan.
Okay, Matt. I didn't. I was gonna. Yeah. Okay, Matt. I thought, but anyhow, so there was that movement, and you know, at the time, it was sort of like a predecessor to Black Lives Matter. It was a way for Black folks to celebrate, and you know, I didn't realize the power of it back then, but just thinking about this now, that was a beautiful movement. Didn't last, I guess, but no, I think what he's saying here was very interesting about the lighteners and how light skinned persons seem to be credited with all the advancements that Black people made.
Yeah.
I do think that some of that has helped. I remember when my son was very young and he went to Whitehall. He was really upset that he was white because all of his friends were black and Hispanic, and there were a few whites. But he was really upset that he wasn't something other than white. So I think there is progress being made. It's just slow.
Well, right. And Kendai even says he hardly realized his own hypocrisy he used to wear orange contacts, so he would have orange eyes. And he attributed it to that he was trying to look more white. He didn't realize it at the time, but it was cool, why he was doing that.
That was one of the things that I found, like this I think was one of the chapters that struck me the most. And I think it was because the honesty that he had in looking at sort of racism that occurs within a particular race.
Right.
And the way in which colorism is sort of racism that Black folks can have against other Black folks.
Yes.
And I think the honesty in that was really powerful. And even in his own personal story and talking about dating, the women that he was dating in college, and who he was sort of had decided in his own mind were more beautiful and more attractive. And I think it's interesting to think about the impact that sort of racist ideas and racist sort of stereotypes or whatever they are can even impact the way that folks treat each other within a particular race. And I think that was pretty profound to me, this chapter, and sort of how he raises that point.
Right. Either he says in here, either racist policies or Black inferiority explains why white people are wealthier, healthier, and more powerful than Black people today. Either racist policies or Black inferiority explain why light people were wealthier, healthier, and more powerful than dark people in 1920 anyway. So because, lighter people had more advantages. And then he's talking about how, light children are adopted first, had higher incomes, are more or less likely to be trapped in public housing or prisons. And skin bleaching products were raking in millions for the US companies. In India, fairness creams topped $200 million in 2014. Today, skin lighteners are used by 70% of women in Nigeria and 35% in South Africa, and 59% in Congo, and 40% in China, Malaysia, the Philippines, and South Korea.
Wow.
Wow.
So,
He did mention about white people tanning themselves to be darker.
yes.
Which is so ironic. It's so ironic that
It's like we meet in the middle. The Black get lighter and we get darker.
we're never comfortable in our own skin.
Amen.
Right. Yes. Well, all right. Now, give some examples of how you've witnessed colorism or color anti-racism around standards of beauty in public media. And how might we use examples of color anti-racism in our church, family, or community? And the first thing I thought of was putting up more Black Jesuses, or the real color,
Middle Eastern
Middle
people.
Eastern.
yes, Middle Eastern. Because what I'm thinking of is, yes, what do we have in, I bet you they're hanging lots of Sunday school rooms still, the
Settlements, Head
1950s
of Christ,
pictures
yes.
of Jesus,
Yeah.
I bet they're there still. We could find lots.
Mm.
And, and Middle Eastern Mary and Middle Eastern. But what about our terminology of dark is bad and dark is evil? And I thought it was interesting that scripture that, about the reading, that prayer at the beginning about let there be darkness.
Mhm.
The two examples thinking about sort of media and culture and stuff like that that come to mind for me, obviously I think the first one that comes to mind is just Michael Jackson as a case study,
Oh, yeah.
in Skin Lightning and just that whole perception. I mean, he was a black icon, and then underwent all of those treatments in the Lightning, and just the whole way that, so the black community, at least in sort of my experience, I think there's still a struggle there to try to make sense of how do we feel about Michael Jackson, right? Because obviously that doesn't change his blackness in terms of a representation of their artistry and musicianship and talent and stuff like that, and yet by the end of his life did not look very black. And it's just, I think there is a struggle of what do we do with Michael Jackson. The other one that came to mind for me was the most recent sort of outcry / manufactured anger over when they decided that they were going to make that live action Little Mermaid and cast a black woman as Ariel.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And all of the hullabaloo of people saying, well, that doesn't make any sense. So you can't cast a fictional character as somebody other than a redheaded animated white girl. Like it to me, those are the two that came to mind right away. But I'm, obviously there's other ones. Those are the ones that that I thought of.
Maybe Ariel should have had purple skin or green skin, or like Shrek or something. I don't know.
I mean, what
And
they
I
should really do is just talk about how she was really just a figure for Hans Christian Andersen in the first place, and they should just make it a man. So,
Oh boy. With Michael Jackson, part of that metamorphosis had to do with his popularity in the Asian market as well, because the Chinese and the Japanese, he was huge over there, and their market's even bigger than here. So if you look at his final images of himself, he was very anime oriented. And so that is almost an example of assimilation for marketing. And that is not unheard of in this century. Look at how Lady Gaga transformed with all kinds of body changes and things to appeal to that kind of youth market and gaming market, surreal type images in her early days. So I think that is just part of our culture today.
Yeah, this might be part of the body chapter, but one thing that seems to be more and more open is hairstyle. That Africans are really allowing their hair to have all kinds of styles, and they're not having to get rid of all the curliness. and make it assimilated into, and in that sense, I think there is some. Now, not everybody appreciates that, but I do think that the very fact that football players are allowed to have hair coming out of their helmets is a step in the right direction.
Step in the right direction too. You know,
Yeah.
that it's freedom for people.
Yeah, it's
I'll let my
recognizing,
hair be.
right. It's recognizing our diversity and our difference and celebrating our bodies.
I know there's some old National Geographic photos of tribes in Africa where the women had fire red hair, like Santa Claus red hair, things like that. And people back in the day thought that was, oh my gosh, that's so primitive and so this and that. And what do you see in the streets of New York and Paris and all over in Allentown and Reading is women, white people with red dyed bright red hair. So
Or green hair or blue hair or
that's right. My granddaughter, for her brother's graduation from boot camp in the Marines, when we went down and dyed her hair marine red. It was great.
Wow.
It was easy to find her in the crowd. It was
There you go.
I think that that kind of thing where you can still do something with your hair, it's a sign of, it's one thing that you're not controlled about. You know, there's so many controls in our life that if you can do whatever you want with your hair, that's it's a sign of your freedom, your independence.
That's right.
So, can somebody tell me what time it is? My computer says 5:10.
That is
8:10.
It's 10 after,
8:10.
yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure how to change the time on there, why it's wrong, but I'm thinking like, okay, my phone wasn't there. So we're, you know, as I said, we just want to finish up on time. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 10, which is white. And because I think this is all related, I think all the things, you know, about this, okay. And it says, we must separate the warlike, greedy, bigoted, and individualistic cultures of modern empire and racial capitalism from the cultures of white people. To be anti-racist is to never mistake the global march of white racism for the global march of white people. To be anti-racist is to never mistake the anti-racist hate of white racism for the racist hate of white people, he says. And I think that is helpful. I think that's helpful for this chapter. He's again telling us to separate it out.
I found it fascinating that he went through a stage in his life when he was reading some of these notions from the Nation of Islam that were actually saying, why are white people so evil? And all these myths. And his last myth was that we're aliens, because that's the only explanation
Right, yes.
that could have them as to how white people could be so oppressive and evil. I thought it was fascinating that there are these mythologies, and that he went through this stage that he then realized that he was being as much a racist as white people were to black. That was just interesting.
I like Clarence's comment though on that. Clarence is his
roommate,
the side of reason, where he tells them,
right, and they could
well,
reproduce.
you can't breed with aliens.
Yeah, yeah,
right,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
And I thought he says black people can be racist towards white people. Whenever someone classifies people of European descent as biologically, culturally, or behaviorally inferior, whenever someone says there is something wrong with white people as a group, someone is articulating a racist idea. So whenever we talk about groups, we're articulating racist ideas. when we point our finger and say they, or whatever.
And I like what
Only-
he's, oh, go ahead.
Okay, the only thing wrong with white people is when they embrace racist ideas and policies and then deny their ideas and policies are racist.
There's a quote in here that I had marked that he says, anti-white racism is indeed the hate that hate produced.
Mm,
Yeah.
mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Which is a fancy way of saying it's not right, but we kind of deserve it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Matt.
Mm,
And we must discern the difference between racist power, racist policymakers, and white people.
mhm.
Of course, ordinary white people benefit from racist policies, though not nearly as much as racist power, and not nearly as much as they could from an equitable society, one where the average white voter could have as much power as a super rich white man to decide elections and shape policy. And that was interesting because he did talk about, how, oppress, where voter oppression and making it harder, and they have to wait in line longer at some of these places to vote and making it more
Take
difficult.
away voting places too. Yeah.
I was surprised how angry he is or was about the 2000 election that Gore, he was so angry that Gore and the Democrats gave up so easy in Florida. That was interesting to me. I didn't realize it was that close, or that some black folks felt that the Democrats caved on in 2000. I didn't realize that.
Well,
I
that
never
was
thought
where
about
they
it being
they were
racist.
counting. I remember how
chads.
laborious that was because they had to
Count the
recount it.
Chads.
Mhm.
Hanging chads
Yeah.
and pregnant chads.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
But we're totally unaware of the corruption that was involved in order to create that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just like,
Yeah.
nobody investigated that at all
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah.
And now look where we are.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder, back with Gore, I wonder, probably the plan was to target racial minority communities and mess with their voting so that Bush could win.
Well, that's what he said.
I
Yeah.
bet it was, yeah. I mean,
I never thought about it that way before until, with this whole thing,
Right.
Well, I think his point, though, about the way in which a fair and equitable society would be beneficial to all its members is one of the things that needs to be, I think it needs to be articulated even more. Because I think one of the things that we hear, or at least that I hear most from other white folks when we talk about racial justice and racial equity and different things that you like, what's the way forward, is, well, what do we stand to lose, right? Like, what?
Yes.
And it's like to realize that we're already losing. like it's what do we stand to gain because we're putting policies and structures into place to ensure fairness and equity. Like, that means we can ensure it for ourselves as well. Like, it's one of the stats that always stands out to me is when I hear people talk about welfare and the stereotype about, that welfare is all minorities, and realizing that the number of white people on welfare is greater than
right.
any other racial group. And so, like, yeah, if you take away welfare, you're hurting more white people than you are anybody else.
And welfare was a good thing
And
when it
yeah.
was started for whites, but then when
Yeah.
blacks, that's
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, but it would still hurt more white folks than it would
Yeah.
the minorities
Right.
if they were just to do away with it. And yet you have white folks arguing like, no, let's just do away with it. Whatever. It's like it's a bad thing. And it's so, I think it's just, those are the kind of things, like, I think to realize that the kind of structural and systemic changes that would benefit racial equity are going to benefit a significant number of it's going to benefit white folks too. And it's like, it's not a zero-sum game where it's like either white folks are going to benefit or we're going to lose something and then somebody else is going to gain something. Like, that's not how it works.
Isn't that was brought up in the earlier chapters? That it's not one gains when one gains, someone else, the other group loses. It actually, everyone wins.
Isn't that a biblical concept?
Yeah, I know. But I guess we don't believe it. We've been taught that, why is it that we've been taught that, if we do away, that only, but where do we get those stereotypes again, that only, Black people are on welfare? And where does that come from? Because I do try to, when I meet with friends and they say something like that, or, that, I try to correct that. Or just
Right.
say it, put it that way. Now, I'm not going to correct their thinking, but I do challenge that.
I would probably suggest that if you looked at the news media in the last 10, 20 years, whenever they show the people in need, they're showing people of minority groups. They're not showing people from Appalachia and other places in white communities. But if you come to Bethlehem, you will see many of all different diversity coming to the food pantry and to the emergency shelter. But the media doesn't often show that. And I would be shocked if that wasn't part of the problem.
Mhm.
Because when in the past, when you're playing to a white majority, you're only going to show what makes the white majority comfortable.
Right. And he talked about that. It may be the next chapter, but he talked about that, writing that paper, and they told him, well, you either, I'll have to find it now. You either get rid of that paper or you don't have a job anymore. He took something to his column that he had written. It's on the Black. So that's the next chapter, but he wrote something about duel between anti-racism and assimilation. And when he started to talk about it too much, they told him, you have to get rid of your column or you don't have a job anymore. And so then he got rid of his column, because, I guess he had other places to think about, but because again, making people uncomfortable, and that's what the TV, we don't want to
That's
make people
where is that where his mentor or his boss told him that story about and he used the N-word, which was so
Yeah.
The niggers, yeah.
that was
and where he realized that even people of color do that within
Yes.
their own culture for anything that's a negative behavior or a negative, and to separate themselves from the negative. Uh, I was trying to think, what do we do? What do white people do to do that separation?
Well, liberals call other people rednecks, and rednecks call other people woke. So we have our own ways. of doing
Yeah, okay. I was trying. And is that to one-upmanship for ourselves so that we're not like them and pointing,
Right.
that we're not like them.
I thought I saw the light bulb.
So, yeah. All right, well, I think this is a good place to end. We didn't do the black chapter, but we can do that next week. The black, it goes with the white though, pretty much. But I think I want to talk about the nigger thing because I think that's like a big discussion point and stuff for us. But because now I see it is 8:24, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I think that's a good place for us to end. Any parting shots of?
Just that. Thank you, Linda, for
Yeah, thanks for
facilitating.
leading.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
well, I'll facilitate next week and we'll keep moving right along because again, I feel like this is helpful discussion, but I want to get it done for the fall.
You're an
Me
honest
too.
facilitator.
So, well, we'll see. So, all right, have a good night and thanks for letting everybody in, Matt.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't have to let anybody in.
Okay, well, that's true.
Nobody tried
but-
to join after I got
Right.
the reins here, but
Right,
I will stop the recording and then we'll
okay, please
call it
do.
a night. Yeah.
That'll be good. Okay, have a good